Lecture 20, Ovid.
Welcome to Lecture 20, in which we will look at the work of one more Roman poet, Publius Ovidius Naso, or Ovid, as he's better known in English. Ovid was born on the 20th of March, 43 BC, and he died probably in AD 17. His life thus encompasses some of the most turbulent and important years of Roman history. He was born just 1 year and a few days after the assassination of Julius Caesar. He was just entering his teens when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and he died 3 years after the death of Augustus. Now, these crucial historical events had little direct influence on Ovid's work. He didn't write directly about political events, but they may well have been a defining element in the last years of his life. He doesn't write directly about politics. He does mention both Julius Caesar and Augustus in his great work Metamorphoses, as we'll see later in the lecture. But though he didn't write about politics, Ovid apparently in some way fell afoul of Augustus, and he was exiled. Ovid was exiled in AD 8 for some offense that he had committed against the Emperor Augustus, as we'll talk about more in just a bit. Thus, the impact of the current political world on his own life, though not directly on his work, was central. Ovid first came into prominence in Roman literary circles as a writer of erotic poetry. His amatory works include Amores, which means loves, literally, love poems, Ars Amatoria, the lover's art or the art of loving, and Remedia Amoris, the cures for love, as well as a handbook on makeup, just as a sideline. Ovid's collection of love elegies, Amores, was published in or after 16 BC, and this collection consists of 3 books, 3 scrolls, which contain 15, 20, and 15 short love elegies, respectively. Amores presents itself as the autobiographical adventures of a poet-lover smitten with a woman whom he calls Corinna, and he presents her to us as probably a married woman, at the very least the formal concubine of someone else. There's a poem, for instance, in which he talks about attending a dinner party where Corinna is present with her probably husband. The Latin word he uses is vir, which just means man, but normally also means husband. So Corinna is either married or formally allied with someone else, and Ovid, like Catullus before him, is the excluded, illegitimate lover. The tone of Amores is urbane, witty, and to some extent detached. There's very little of the anguish represented in some of Catullus's poems to Lesbia. So that's Amores, Ovid's first amatory work. Ars Amatoria, the art of loving, the lover's art, was published around 1 BC, and the Remedia Amores probably between 1 BC and AD 2. Ars Amatoria is a 3-book manual on methods of courtship and seduction. The first 2 books are addressed to men and the third to women. Remember, all of this is in poetry, so it's humorous in tone. Ovid is pretty clearly parodying serious didactic poetry. He's saying, let me teach you how to seduce a woman, or in the third book addressed to women, let me teach you how to attract men. Remedia Amoris, Love's Remedies, tells readers how to end a love affair, how to make yourself fall out of love when you're tired of it. He suggests, among other things, finding the one flaw that your beloved has. Everybody has at least one really terrible physical flaw, and just making yourself concentrate on that. Think about that all the time, and before you know it, you're not in love any longer. Ovid also clearly had a deep interest in mythology as well as in love elegy, and the 2 interests first intersected in his work Heroides, which is a set of letters from mythological women to their faithless lovers. One of these letters is written in the persona of Phaedra, the same Phaedra whom we talked about in Euripides' great play Hippolytus, and whom you'll see again in Part 5 with Professor Heinzelman when you study Racine's play Phaedra, the French version of the Hippolytus story. So Phaedra is a mythological character who keeps reappearing in this course. The intersection between mythology and erotic poetry is equally clear in Ovid's great work Metamorphoses, which is what I'm going to concentrate on in this lecture. as we shall see, Metamorphoses, which was probably written around AD 2, takes the transformation of bodies from one form to another as its primary subject matter, humans turning into flowers or trees or animals of one form or another, but it deals as much with eroticism as with transformation. And Ovid's interest in mythology was clear in one further work, Fasti, which set out to treat the Roman calendar 1 month per book and to discuss religious and mythological associations with each day. The Fasti is incomplete and incompletely preserved. Only the first 6 books of it survive, but it's a highly learned Alexandrian and Callimacheian work, and one which pays homage to Augustus's goal of reinstating old-fashioned Roman religious practices. So Ovid had a very wide range of forms of writing and of subject matter, but clearly amatory poetry, erotic poetry, is one of his primary interests. His works of light-hearted amatory advice seem to have had very, very serious consequences in Ovid's own life. In AD 8, as I already mentioned, he was exiled by Augustus and was sent to Tomis, an outpost on the Black Sea. He was never allowed to return home again, and he absolutely hated it there at Tomis. It had been ill-advised for Ovid to write as he did, because in 18 BC, Augustus had undertaken a program of reforms, usually referred to by historians as Augustus's moral reforms or his social reforms, particularly trying to rein in the sexual behavior of Roman society. Upper-class Roman society of the late 1st century BC was one in which divorce was very, very common, and adultery was, if not openly condoned, at least normally overlooked. Augustus set out to rectify this situation. Among other things, in 18 BC, Augustus had made adultery a criminal offense with heavy penalties. The adulterous couple were exiled to 2 separate islands, and don't think a nice, luxurious, wonderful resort-type island. These were small, very, very rugged, very barren islands. So the adulterous couple would be exiled to 2 different islands. And a husband who did not divorce his adulterous wife was subject to be tried himself on charges that he was a pimp. So Augustus criminalized adultery, which previously had been purely a private matter, and passed rather stringent laws to enforce the criminalization of adultery. He had also passed laws attempting to increase the marriage and birth rates, especially among the Roman upper class. Now, just as a side note of social history, it didn't work. Legislating morality is a very difficult thing to do. Augustus's moral reforms do not seem to have had much effect at all. And in fact, he was hoist with his own petard when he had to exile his only and beloved daughter Julia for committing adultery. He had passed the laws saying that adulterers had to be exiled to islands. Julia was engaged in adultery, and he had to exile his own daughter. But in this context, in the context of Augustus's social reforms or moral reforms, Ovid's treatment of seduction and specifically of adultery must have seemed like a direct slap in Augustus's face, deliberate defiance of the moral program that Augustus was trying to lay out for society. Remember, in Amores, Ovid writes about his, or at least his poetic persona's, ongoing affair with Corinna, who is probably married. In Ars Amatoria, in The Art of Loving, part of the advice he gives is on how to seduce married women. In fact, he says to young men that married women are particularly good for seduction purposes because they can't kick up a fuss when you want to dump them. They're married, they can't make things difficult for you. In other words, in both of these works, Ovid treats seduction and adultery as matters for urbane witticism, and Augustus cannot have been pleased about this. But Ovid's erotic poems were published years before his exile in AD 8. Remember, Amores was published in 16 BC, Ars Amatoria probably in 1 BC. He wasn't exiled until AD 8, so there must have been some other contributing factor to the exile. And in fact, Ovid himself gives us some clues about this. In exile, he wrote 2 books lamenting his exclusion from Rome, 2 books called Tristia, which means basically sad songs, and Ex Ponto, From the Black Sea. In these two books, Tristia and Ex Ponto, he expressed his unhappiness in Thomas and beseeched Augustus to allow him to come home. And Ovid says in his own defense that his erotic poetry wasn't meant to be taken seriously, and he says that it was no more offensive than Catullus's poems to Lesbia or than Virgil's presentation of the affair between Aeneas and Dido. Now, that's a bit disingenuous in a couple of ways. For one thing, Catullus's poems to Lesbia, from Augustus's point of view, may have been quite offensive indeed, but Catullus was dead. Catullus had died back in 54, long before Augustus's social reforms. As for Dido and Aeneas, Virgil was not writing "go thou and do likewise" advice. He was dealing in mythological time, while Ovid at least presents his own poems, in Ars Amatoria in particular, as specific, direct advice on how young men ought to behave. In Tristia, Ovid hints at another reason for his exile. He says that he was banished because of Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. The poem in question was almost undoubtedly Ars Amatoria, the lover's art, but what was the mistake? Ovid's own hints seem to indicate that he was somehow involuntarily involved in a scandal concerning Augustus's family. He hints that he saw or perhaps heard, learned about something he wasn't supposed to know. That's pretty much all he tells us. There have been many, many theories. We'll probably never know, barring the discovery of some evidence that we haven't yet found. We'll never know the exact nature of Ovid's mistake. But whatever it was, it sounds as though his erotic poetry had already put him on Augustus's bad side. And then somewhere around AD 8, Ovid stumbled on, found out about, in some way became involved with something that he really should not have known, and so he was exiled. Whatever it was, whatever the mistake was, it was serious enough that he was never allowed to return to Rome, not even after the death of Augustus in 14. Augustus's successor, Tiberius, left Ovid in exile, and Ovid died in exile. He never returned to Rome. Ovid's most influential and still most widely read work is Metamorphoses, or Transformations. To this work, we owe our knowledge of some of the most important myths of Greco-Roman antiquity. There are several very important myths, the story of Niobe and her children, for instance, which we have in the fullest form in Ovid's Metamorphoses. We have references in other authors, but Ovid is the one who tells us the full story. However, Metamorphoses itself defies easy categorization into any particular genre. On the purely formal level, Metamorphoses is an epic in the sense that it is a lengthy work, 15 books, written in dactylic hexameter. However, it is utterly unlike the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, completely unlike in its subject matter and its organization, what we normally think of as epics. The only other even vaguely comparable epic that's come down to us is Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, about the nature of things, written around 55 BC, which is a philosophical and scientific work in 6 books of dactylic hexameter on Epicureanism and ancient atomic theory. I wish we had time to talk about Lucretius in this course. It's a fascinating work in its own right. But Lucretius's tone in De Rerum Natura is serious and didactic, whereas Ovid in Metamorphoses is witty, ironic, and at times downright scandalous. So we tend to call it an epic because it's a long work in dactylic hexameter, but it is certainly unlike what we normally think of as epic. And the subject matter of Metamorphoses also resists easy categorization. On the most basic level, the thread that holds the whole work together is bodies changed into other forms. That's what Ovid says he's going to write about in the opening lines of the work. And on one level, this is indeed his subject matter. Every story Ovid tells includes some sort of transformation. But in several cases, the transformation, the metamorphosis, is so very incidental to the story as to be almost invisible. One good example is the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, a pair of young lovers, the prototypical Romeo and Juliet, who are prevented from marrying by their parents, run away together, and in a series of misunderstandings, each one of them thinks the other is dead, each one of them commits suicide. That's the story. At the very, very end, Ovid mentions almost as a casual throwaway that Pyramus stabbed himself under a mulberry tree, and the blood of the two dead lovers, Pyramus and Thisbe, dyed the berries of the mulberry tree. Before that they had been white, now they're a deep reddish purple. So there is a transformation, a change of the colors of the berries, but it's pretty clearly just added on so that Ovid can include this story in Metamorphoses. Another way of reading Metamorphoses is to see the overall linking thread as, once again, an interest in eroticism in all its guises, from utterly romantic love through the most horrifying sexual perversions. Ovid covers the whole gamut of erotic possibility and experience. Some of his stories are deceptively charming and sentimental, at least on the surface, such as the tale of the old couple Baucis and Philemon, an old married couple who are granted one wish by the gods, and their one wish is to die at the same moment after all their years of marriage, so that neither one will have to bury the other. And the gods are so touched by this that instead of having them die at the same time, they turn the devoted old couple into trees standing side by side with intertwined branches. So we get this kind of romantic, charming, sentimental story. Other stories in Metamorphoses portray perversions of all sort, from literal narcissism in the story of Narcissus, a man who falls in love with his own reflection in a pool of water and pines away out of insatiable desire for himself, through Pygmalion, a man who falls in love with a statue of a woman that he himself has made, to horrific tales of father-daughter incest or of brothers-in-law raping and mutilating their sisters-in-law. As I say, Ovid runs the entire possible gamut of erotic or eroticized stories. A great many of his stories, since he is using mythological tales to a large extent, involve male gods seducing and or raping humans, both male and female, and also females, both divine and human. Examples include Apollo and Daphne, Apollo chasing and trying to catch the nymph Daphne, Jove and Io. Io is a young human woman who ends up being turned into a cow to hide her from the wrath of Juno. Now, Ovid's overall tone in Metamorphoses is one of ironic detachment from the stories, whether he's telling us an utterly charming story or one that is hair-raisingly horrifying. Ovid maintains a tone of ironic detachment. Another pattern that we can discern in Metamorphoses is that most of Ovid's stories are myths. As I said, it is the fullest account that we have of some of the most important myths of Greco-Roman antiquity. Now, this isn't surprising, since his ostensible theme is the transformation of bodies into other forms. He's limited in the stories that he can draw from everyday life. We don't normally, after all, see girls turning into trees or cows or other such things happening in the everyday world. But Ovid says in his prologue that he intends his story to run from the beginning of the world down to his own day. He wants to look at bodies transformed into other shapes, starting at the beginning of the world and ending up in his very own time, his own day. At the beginning of the last book, the beginning of Book 15, he includes a speech said in the mouth of Pythagoras, the great mathematician, philosopher Pythagoras, in which Pythagoras describes both the transmigration of souls and the transformations of all physical entities into others. Pythagoras talks about how at our death, our bodies are transmuted into other physical forms through decay and the transfer of our essences into other physical forms. Pythagoras talks about how areas that are now dry land were once sea, how if you could speed up time, in other words, you could see that the entire natural order of the world is one of continual transformation of one thing into another, of one shape, one form, one body into another. And so in this last book of Metamorphoses, transformation is presented as the natural order of existence, both in souls moving from one body to another and in the physical world continually and constantly going through a change of shape. But these natural transformations are not the only recent metamorphoses which Ovid catalogues. He also includes the supposed apotheosis of Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar died, he supposedly was transformed into a god. That's what apotheosis means, transformation into a god. And Ovid includes this as one of the transformations he catalogues near the end of his work. He says, he's just described the reception of the Greek god of healing, Asclepius, into Rome, and then Ovid says, that one approached our altars as a stranger, but Caesar is a god in his own city, raised up to heaven, changed into a star, blazing so brilliantly, not by his own remarkable success in war and peace, not by the battles that were crowned in triumph, nor by his service to the commonwealth, nor yet by glory that hastened to his side, but rather by his offspring. For no deed has Caesar done that stands out more than this. He is the father of our own Augustus. So at the end here, Ovid presents the transformation of Julius Caesar into a god, which supposedly appeared as a comet before the Roman people. There was the idea that Caesar's soul was seen after his death in the shape of a comet or a star. Ovid presents this transformation of Caesar as glorifying Caesar himself, yes, but as casting even more glory on Augustus. And Ovid predicts that Augustus, too, will be deified, will undergo apotheosis at his death. Now, this leads us to one important interpretive question about metamorphoses, namely Ovid's presentation of or attitude towards Augustus in the work. Clearly, a work this complex and multivalent raises all kinds of critical and interpretive issues, but I want to focus in on the question of what exactly is Ovid trying to do in his presentation of Augustus and the things he says about and to Augustus. Now, Metamorphoses was probably written around AD 2, perhaps even a bit later. And one way of viewing its elaborate praise, one might say fulsome praise, of Augustus in the last book, is to assume that Ovid was hoping to redeem himself for the overtly erotic poetry he'd written earlier, that he knew he had annoyed the emperor, he knew he had annoyed Augustus, and perhaps he was hoping to make it up to Augustus by writing this poem full of praise for him. If we take that this way, we should assume that passages praising Julius Caesar, who was Augustus's adoptive father and actual great-uncle, we should assume that passages praising Julius Caesar and Augustus should be taken at face value, if we assume that Ovid is genuinely trying to make up for his former offenses against Augustus by praising him here, then we should take those passages at face value, or at least we should suppose that Ovid hoped Augustus would take them at face value. But another way of looking at this, equally possible, is that Ovid is, without much forethought for his own safety, mocking Augustus in this supposed praise. In the penultimate passage of the text, right before the end, Ovid compares Augustus to a line of famous gods and heroes. He's talking about how these gods and heroes, each one surpassed his own father, and he's saying, you will be even greater than your father, your adoptive father, Julius Caesar. Ovid says, so Atreus gave way to Agamemnon, Aegeus to Theseus, Peleus to Achilles, and finally, as no inapt example, so Saturn in the later light of Jove. For Jupiter rules kingdoms up above as well as air and sea and earth below. On earth Augustus rules, and like great Jove, he is our father and our governor. Now, ostensibly, the point here is to say that Augustus must be content, must accept the fact that he will surpass his father Julius Caesar, just as the heroes of old surpassed their own fathers. But the examples Ovid picks are each and every one of them negative examples of father-son violence and vengeance, or at the very least neglect in the case of Achilles and Peleus. Achilles was absent from his father Peleus in the Iliad. The culminating example, Saturn and Jove, any of you who are familiar with Greek mythology will know that Jove, or Zeus, overthrew his father Saturn, or Kronos, in a 10-year war and imprisoned his father in the underworld. So if you want to give examples of sons surpassing their father's glory as a good and positive thing, you could hardly do worse than pick these examples that Ovid uses here. One final tease in the book, whatever we decide to make of Ovid's presentation of Augustus, whether he is trying genuinely to praise Augustus, whether he's doing this tongue-in-cheek with sort of a wink at his own sophisticated audience, but the hope that Augustus himself is stupid enough to take it at face value, or whether he's openly mocking Augustus and paying no attention to the consequences, those are issues that we probably can't settle. It depends on one's own interpretation of Ovid's work. But one final tease in the book comes in its very last lines, where Ovid announces that his own fame will live forever. He closes the poem by writing, "My work is finished now. No wrath of Jove, nor sword, nor fire, nor futurity is capable of laying waste to it. Let that day come, then, when it wishes to, which only has my body in its power, and put an end to my uncertain years. No matter. For in spirit I will be borne up to soar beyond the distant stars, immortal in the name I leave behind. Wherever Roman governance extends over the subject nations of the world, my words will be upon the people's lips. And if there is truth in poets' prophecies, then in my fame forever I will live." Now, on the one hand, this idea of the poet living on after his death in his work, that's a common poetic topos in Roman literature from the Roman poet Ennius, who lived from 239 to 169 BC onward. On the other hand, I like to see this as the final transformation in a book about transformations. This is clearer, the point I want to make is clearer in the Latin than in this translation, where the translation I'm using says, "My words will be upon the people's lips." Ovid actually says, "Ore legar populi," I shall be read in the mouth of the people. Not my words shall be read, or my words shall be spoken, but I shall be read in the mouths of the people. And then he ends up, "I shall live." Is he saying, in effect, that he, the poet, in the final transformation of the work, the poet becomes the book, and suddenly the book itself is speaking to us rather than the poet? I shall be read in the mouth of people. Now, to some extent, of course, that's just a shorthand we use talking about any author. What are you reading? I'm reading Homer. What are you studying? I'm studying Thucydides. We know there that we use the author's name to mean the author's work. But I think Ovid, in as sophisticated a work as Metamorphoses, may be playing with that. I shall be read, I shall be spoken in the people's mouths, and I shall live. He becomes his book. Well, whatever he meant by saying I shall live, Metamorphoses had incalculable influence on later Western literature and culture. The chances of literary transmission are partially responsible for this, since, as I said, many Greco-Roman myths are preserved in their fullest form in Ovid's work, and one result of that was that some later authors used Metamorphoses, at least in part, as a kind of handbook of mythological tales. If you wanted to know a Greek myth on a certain topic, you went to Ovid and looked it up. There are some real difficulties with this approach to Metamorphoses. It is a highly polished, self-consciously ironic production, and that means that using this text as a straightforward handbook of classical myth is deeply problematic. Ovid very likely altered at least some of the myths he used, and he may well at times have been self-consciously working against the standard version of a myth, turning it around, standing on its head, doing different things with it. When he's the only version we have, in other words, it's very dangerous to assume that Ovid is ever giving us the straightforward, simple, common version of a myth. Now, some later authors moved in the opposite direction and treated Metamorphoses as a storehouse of proto-Christian allegories, so that Ovid's stories could be read with profit by Christian readers. The allegorical use of Ovid reached its high point in the 14th century in a 70,000-verse French poem entitled Ovid moralisé, Ovid moralized. And in this work, for instance, the flight of Daedalus and his son Icarus to escape the imprisonment in the labyrinth of Crete, that flight was read as an allegory of the soul's flight towards God. Daphne, the nymph who was turned into a tree by her father, a river god, to protect her from being raped by the god Apollo, was clearly, according to this allegorical interpretation, a representation of the Virgin Mary. So Ovid was used as Christian allegory to a great extent, particularly in France and on the continent. His influence wasn't limited by any means to the continent. The first English translation of Ovid appeared in 1480 by William Caxton and was followed by Golding's magnificent translation of 1567. For English literature and culture, the most important element of Ovid's popularity lies in his influence on Shakespeare. It's abundantly clear that Shakespeare knew Metamorphoses very, very well indeed. If Shakespeare attended the grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon, he would have read Ovid in Latin as part of his schooling there, but he also clearly, without question, consulted Golding's translation. There are similarities of phrasing, similarity of wording. Metamorphoses permeate Shakespeare's work to an extraordinary extent. It seems that when Shakespeare wants a point of comparison, Ovid is the first example that springs into his mind. And so when we consider the extent of Shakespeare's influence on later English literature, it's no exaggeration to say that Ovid does indeed still live. In our next lecture, we will move on from Roman poetry to Roman prose, and we will look at the development of Roman historiography.